When we concluded the previous week, we saw Jacob and Laban separating as the angel of God had called Jacob to return to Canaan, his native land, in Genesis 31, verses 11 through 13. Remember that Jacob has become prosperous along the way. He has 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah, 11 sons, and 1 daughter. Up to this point, we have seen the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob grow according to God's promise. But it will take some time for God's promises to be fulfilled in the Bible story. So let's continue thinking about the rest of the book of Genesis now. We begin with Jacob returning to Canaan. Jacob went on his way after Laban met with him and bid his family farewell. As he traveled, Jacob and Esau met peacefully. Note that it had been at least 20 years since they had seen each other. Along the way, Jacob wrestled with one who is identified as a man who dislocated Jacob's hip. If we read Genesis 32, verses 24 and 25, it says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. And so then this one changed his name to Israel, verses 26 through 28. Then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked Jacob. Or the man asked. "Jacob," he replied. "Your name will no longer be Jacob," he said. "It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Later, we see Jacob lived in Shechem, in the land of Canaan for a time in chapter 33, verses 16 through 20, before being called by God to go to Luz, or Bethel, in Genesis chapter 35 and in verse 1. God said to Jacob, "Get up, go to Bethel and settle there. Build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." Well, in Bethel, God then appeared to Jacob again and blessed him. Let's read verses now 10 through 15 of Genesis 35. It says, God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. You will no longer be named Jacob, but your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. God also said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation indeed, an assembly of nations will come from you, and kings will descend from you. I will give to you the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, and I will give the land to your future descendants." Then God withdrew from him at the place where he had spoken to him. Jacob set up a marker at the place where he had spoken to him, a stone marker. He poured a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. Jacob named the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. And so again, you see, here is Jacob being called Israel. And so we're going to use that name a lot moving forward in the Bible story as we see then this nation that comes from Jacob will be called Israel, the Israelites. And this identification of kings coming from him as well is something to keep in mind as we continue to move forward. So from there, Jacob moved toward Ephrath, or Bethlehem. However, while they were on the way, Rachel died in childbirth in chapter 35, verses 16 through 20, and Benjamin was born. So his 12th son, Benjamin, but his wife Rachel died. Finally, Jacob arrived back to his father Isaac at Mamre in Kiriath Arba, or Hebron, in chapter 35 and in verse 27, he comes back to Isaac, where Abraham and Isaac had stayed in this place. So, as Jacob has now returned to Canaan, and now we can see Joseph's journey to Egypt is what the Bible story really focuses on in the next section here of Genesis. And then we're going to particularly pay attention as Joseph's story here is really the focus throughout the rest of the book and different aspects of this, and just a fascinating story over the last 13, 14 chapters of the book of Genesis. So remember that the relationships in Jacob's family were quite troubled, beginning with the conflicts between his wives. Remember, as we had studied about, that Rachel was Jacob's favorite, and you had Leah, but she was being given children, and the competition that they had for children got their servants involved and so forth. And so this is how we read, and we've got Jacob now with 12 sons, 1 daughter. And remember that Joseph, who was Rachel's firstborn, was clearly Jacob's favorite son, as we see identified in Genesis chapter 37, verses 3 and 4. So this competition clearly went beyond just the wives and their bearing children, but it carried on to the children themselves. It says, now Israel, remember that's Jacob, Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made him a long-sleeved robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. And so we've got in this text that his brothers just hate him now. And so we should recognize that the position that this then puts Joseph in. Joseph, who is 17 years old as we're coming into this section of Scripture. And we see that Joseph then had 2 dreams that resulted in his brothers hating him even more. We come down to verse 5, and it shows us more about that. And we have these 2 dreams about his brothers, his parents bowing down to him. And his brothers just hated him. His parents kept it in mind. So the dreams indicated that Joseph's parents would bow down before him. Verses 10 and 11 explain that. He told his father and brothers, and his father rebuked him. What kind of dream is this that you have had? He said, Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So then after this, what we see is that Joseph's brothers took advantage of an opportunity to try to kill him, as we look in verse 18 and into verse 20. They saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, "Oh, look, here comes that dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." And so you can just see the hatred that they had for Joseph, and now the conspiracy to kill him in this particular text due to that hatred. However, we see that Reuben suggested that they spare his life in verses 21 and 22. When Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let's not take his life." Reuben also said to them, "Don't shed blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him," intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. So through this, we see that Joseph was spared of his life and not killed as the other brothers were suggesting. So Joseph was thrown into a pit, and he was sold to the Ishmaelites or the Midianites, and taken to Egypt, as we look in chapter 37, verses 23 through 28. It says, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the long-sleeved robe that he had on. They took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, without water. They sat down to eat a meal, and when they looked up, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin, going down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. And so this shows us how Joseph's life was spared. This shows us how Joseph then is on his way to Egypt and makes his way down there, having been sold into slavery now. Well, Joseph's brothers then took the coat of many colors that Jacob had made, and to make it appear that he had been killed by a wild animal in chapter 37, verses 31 through 35. So, as we continue on through this journey, we see what happens to Joseph when he's down in Egypt. Joseph, we find, was sold to an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and this officer, who was named Potiphar. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 36, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guards. In chapter 39, in verse 1, now Joseph had been taken to Egypt, and an Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. And so we're going to pick up Joseph's story now, as the Bible is focused on what happens to Joseph, and this is going to tie back and be very significant to the development of the overall Bible story as we continue to see. But we see the Lord was with Joseph and caused everything Joseph was doing to be successful, so that Joseph was given authority over everything in Potiphar's house. Let's continue reading in chapter 39, verses 2 through 6, and see how the Lord had blessed Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So you can just see how much God's been with Joseph and how much God is blessing him. And Potiphar's prospering through all of this as well and has confidence in Joseph. However, we get to another wrinkle in the story, so to speak, another twist in the story of Joseph as you think about all that he's been through to be in this place, in this strange land, having been cast into the pit. His life was in danger and now sold into slavery, and now he's in Egypt, but yet he's prospering in Egypt. However, we see Joseph was falsely accused of forcing himself on his master's wife, and he was arrested. Let's read verses 7 through 20, and a critical piece to this story that gets us to the next place. After some time, that's Potiphar's Joseph's master's wife, this is Potiphar's wife, looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, With me here, my master does not concern myself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God?" Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment with her and had run outside, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. When he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." She put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story. "The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me, but when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, "These are the things your slave did to me." He was furious and had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison. And you just think about Joseph through all this and what he's going through and being falsely accused now. But still, God was with Joseph in prison so that everything he did prospered, and he was given authority there. In chapter 39, verses 21 through 23, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made him successful, made everything that he did successful." So again, God's with him. And we might think about Joseph and all that he's going through, but yet here's the key piece. As now in prison, the story goes on to show us that two of the Egyptian king's servants, two of Pharaoh's servants, met Joseph here in this place. Chapter 40 and the first 4 verses tells us, after this, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guards in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guards assigned Joseph to them as their personal attendant, and they were in custody for some time. So now, here's Joseph and these 2 officers of Pharaoh in the same prison. And we see that then they both had dreams that they wanted interpreted. And they come to Joseph. That Joseph interprets their dreams for them. And the outcome happened just as Joseph had said, with the chief baker being executed and the chief cupbearer being restored to his former position. Look in chapter 40, verses 20 through 23. "On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he gave a feast for all his servants. He elevated the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But Pharaoh hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had explained to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Joseph had asked to be remembered when these things would happen, but yet he forgot. And these things happened just as Joseph had said. And after 2 years go by, Pharaoh himself had dreams. And Pharaoh looked for someone who would interpret them in chapter 41, verses 1 through 8. And then, at that time, the cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him. Genesis 41, verses 9 through 13. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I remember my faults." Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards. He and I had dreams on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, a slave of the captain of the guards, was with us there. We told him our dreams. He interpreted our dreams for us, and each had its own interpretation. It turned out just the way he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. Well, Pharaoh then sent for Joseph, and Joseph interpreted the dreams. He had these two dreams, and the meaning of the dreams were the same. There were going to be 7 years of great abundance, and then there were going to be 7 years of devastating famine. Chapter 41, verses 28 through 32 says, It is just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and he will carry it out soon. Therefore, Joseph counseled Pharaoh to appoint a wise man over the land to store up the excess during the abundant years so people could survive the famine. And 41 verses 33 through 36. So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take a fifth of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by the famine. Pharaoh, of course, then chose Joseph to oversee this work. Chapter 41, verses 37 through 43. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and he said to them, "Can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I, as king, will be greater than you." Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "See, I am placing you over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with fine linen garments, and placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in his second chariot, and servants called out before him, "Make way." So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. And so we can see how Joseph now is put in this position over the land of Egypt. And through all of this, how God has worked to bring Joseph to this place in this providential way. And Joseph was now 30 years old. You think about this 13-year journey that he's had from 17 to 30 and all that he's been through. But yet, this is critical to the next couple of points that we see in the story, with it, which is then Joseph and his brothers. Well, we see that others came to buy food from Joseph in Egypt during the famine, from every land, right, coming to buy food. This is where there's food during this time of famine. And we see that this also includes Joseph's brothers, except Benjamin, in chapter 42, verses 1 through 5. Well, unbeknownst to them, they bowed before their brother in Egypt, just as Joseph had said concerning his dream prior. And they came seeking food from him. Let's read chapter 42, verses 6 through 9. Joseph was in charge of the country. He sold grain to all its people. His brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. He treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan to buy food," they replied. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the weakness of the land." So Joseph remembered his dreams and determined to put his brothers to the test, seeing if they would treat their father and their youngest brother Benjamin as they had treated him previously. After passing his various tests, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. He asked them about his father and instructed them to relocate to Egypt, relocate their families to Egypt through the famine, particularly to the land of Goshen in chapter 45, verses 1 through 15. Joseph realized that now that God had sent him to Egypt to keep them alive, and thus keeping the lineage needed to fulfill the promises that were made to Abraham alive. Genesis chapter 45, verses 7 and 8 says, "God sent me ahead of you to establish a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." You can see the pieces coming together. Despite all that Joseph has been through in a negative way, how God has been using that to keep this seed alive through a time of famine. Next, we see then that Jacob's family moves to Egypt. Jacob was initially in disbelief to hear Joseph was still alive. However, after he began traveling, God told him not to be afraid to go down to Egypt. Genesis 46, verses 2 through 4. That night, God spoke to Israel in a vision. "Jacob, Jacob," he said. And Jacob replied, "Here I am." God said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you back. Joseph will close your eyes when you die." Interestingly, in the land of Goshen, there were several factors that helped keep the Israelites a separate people. Before Jacob's death, he blessed Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, by making them as his own, thus giving Joseph the inheritance of the firstborn, chapter 48. And then Jacob makes prophetic statements concerning each of his 12 sons in chapter 49. Of particular note concerning the Bible story is that kings would come through Judah until one specific king would come. Genesis 49, verses 8 through 11. "Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches, he lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes. And the obedience of the peoples belong to him. He ties his donkey to a vine, and the colt of his donkey to the choice vine. He washes his clothes in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes." So there's one who's coming, one whose right it is, who's coming. And we'll watch for that as we continue through the Bible story. After Jacob died, his sons buried him in Canaan. Although Joseph's brothers were afraid Joseph would be vengeful toward them, Joseph realized how God had used all that had happened for good. Let's read Genesis 50, verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, "If Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him." So they sent this message to Joseph: "Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph: 'Please forgive your brother's transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when their message came to him. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, "We are your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph realized how all this had happened for good, and he lived to be 110, according to verse 22 of chapter 50. Before he died, he said that God would bring the family out of Egypt to the Canaan land that was promised. And they were to bring his bones with him when that happened. Let's read chapter 50, verses 24 through 26. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. "When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here." Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. So Joseph's confidence, God's going to bring them out. But for now, it was necessary to come down to Egypt. And there they wait. Now, while there have been many twists and turns through the book of Genesis that may leave us questioning how God will fulfill his promises, there are plenty of signs still encouraging us to watch for their fulfillment. We have seen in this lesson how God was able to save his chosen people through a severe famine. Now they will spend some time in Egypt and grow from a large family into an emerging nation when the book of Exodus begins.